Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney, and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 200 people around this question, not to prescribe you with the universal answer, but to help you to find and define your own answer to this question, or at least to explore it. I'm hoping the guests' musings, anecdotes, explorations, and experiences prompt your own inquiry into what this question means to you. Which brings us to this week and the 89th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast, and I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Manda Scott. Manda trained as a veterinary surgeon, but is now an award-winning novelist and host of the Accidental Gods podcast. Best known for her international best-selling Boudica dreaming series, which the New York Times labelled a masterpiece in historical fiction. Her latest novel departs from historical fiction in favour of a contemporary Thrutopian narrative, exploring the potential for a future that we'd be proud to leave as our legacy. Any human power opens doorways we could all walk through, following routes to a paradigm shift we could make happen now. In this captivating and enthralling conversation, Manda takes us on our journey of connecting with the living web of life. We explore what the web is asking of us, learning to learn through pain until we can learn through love, the joyful curiosity that arises from the heart-mind connection, dreaming awake, and the magic of co-creation that our relationships can entail. She outlines the role of artists in envisioning a future that lays the foundation for a new way of being and path to follow. This entire conversation is brimming with hope, connection, curiosity, and considerable insight and wisdom from Manda. And I hope it serves as a window into what is possible when we fully sense and connect with all that is around us, the living web of life. Look, I took so much from this conversation. It felt so alive and connected, and I just simply put, I think Amanda is a real treasure. So I think from her insights and what she's sharing, you're going to take so much from this episode. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe if you're on YouTube. And please continue to leave your lovely reviews if you're on the podcasting platforms. Please check out the show notes below if you'd like to check out more of Manda's work, her latest book, and indeed her podcast, as well as ways for contacting me, whether that's to individually explore your own lines of self-inquiry, take part in my weekly free silent conversations, or you'd like to discuss ways of developing greater trust, connection, and communication amongst your teams. You can also check out the show notes below for the link to the podcast newsletter, where you get to read about the reflections that these conversations that you're listening to have evoked in me. So that's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. And so without further ado, the 89th episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Manda, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. As I just mentioned to you in our pre-chat there, I'm marveling at your capacity to create almost a parallel world to mine that is kind of accompanying me through my day as I'm reading your book, Any Human Power. So I'm really, really grateful to have you here today.
Thank you. And because writing a book is always a really solitary task, and you never know, is it going to work for other people? It might just do nothing. But because it was parallel in my days for about 3 years, and then I discovered that it's parallel in yours. The people in it feel alive to you, and the world that they inhabit feels real, and that's a great gift. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and I'd even just say to that, like, because usually I just jump in with the question straight away, but it is really remarkable, and maybe we can even touch on it at some point. There's a scene in it which you call The Void, in which there's a woman passing from being a living human into the realms beyond human life. And even for that, I found for something I've no previous conception for,
Right.
I had quite a vivid image in my head, which is just, I don't know, I found just the worlds that you're creating in my head to be pretty remarkable.
Thank you, because of course they feel completely ordinary to me, but thank you. That's really good. And as we were saying before, since we're on the rambling before you ask your question, I'm so in awe of the people that you listen to on your podcast. So it genuinely is a huge honor to be here. I'm just enthralled by some of the stories that you are able to evoke from people and the people that you find. It's giving me great hope of the world, that there are so many. I don't know, this must be number 89 nearly. But anyway,
Yeah.
there are this many people who are that so connected. So thank you.
Ah, wonderful. So, Manda, as you are aware, then the first question that I kick this off with is the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Yes, thank you. And of course, I am aware that that's coming, but equally, I tried not to prep for it. So I'm just going to sink in and see what arises. Okay, so the question, pretty much for me, the only one that matters is asking, what do you want of me? But then the obvious question is, what is the you of which I am asking that? And for me, it's the living web of life, that hyper complex system that is, of which we are an integral part, but where we often, certainly in our culture, what Tanya Luhrmann, who's an extraordinary anthropologist, talks about citadel mind as being one of the real strangenesses of our culture. This concept that our mind is somehow an autonomous unit, and what goes out is what we choose, and what comes in is our three senses, and that's it. When every other vibrant living culture throughout the world knows that this is not the case. And so in my world, we are an integral part of the web of life. What matters is whether we choose to acknowledge that and to work with it or not. And neither of these is necessarily easy, but my day-to-day, moment-to-moment task of being is to hold as open as I can to the knowledge that I am an integral part of the web of life and the flow that comes from that, and ask, what do you want of me? And then respond to the answer as best as I can in any given moment. That's it.
That's a very rich answer. With regards to that, like, when would you even have first started to kind of consider life in that way?
In that frame?
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that. There's a number of layers that come up. So I've probably been explicitly expressing it since I started teaching, certainly since I started teaching the Accidental Gods work, which is 7 years ago. But I was teaching what we call Dreaming Awake, the shamanic work. I've been teaching that since the turn of the millennium. And I definitely was asking that, but I probably wasn't expressing it. I was asking it when I started the Boudica books, because that's how they arose. Actually, I was asking it when I started writing. I was probably asking it when I became a vet. All right, if I go back far enough, I have a memory which I am relatively certain is real, but my childhood mind is constructed as if it were real, of being taken by my father to the Brochs, which are ancient prehistoric monuments throughout Scotland, and I think there are some in Ireland. And they were a stone beehive that was 80 feet in diameter, and they were quite high, and they were double walled, so that they went up 7 stories. The cattle would live within the double walls in winter, and then there'd be a roof, and then there'd be the hay, and then there'd be a roof, and then there'd be corn maybe, and then there'd be a roof and other stuff. And the people would live in the center. And there was obviously a team of designers who knew how to design and build these, who were traveling around, because they're all pretty much the same. And Dad took us to the one that was on the mainland opposite Skye at Glenelg, which in those days you could just walk to. It's now private land and difficult, but we just parked the car and walked. And I had just read 2 things. I'd read Last of the Mohicans, because BBC had just done an amazing, in black and white days, television series of that completely was easily one of the best bits of television ever done. Philip Maddock as Magua was just astonishing. I remember that even now. And that had opened my heart and my mind to the fact that, to the reality of Indigenous spiritualities and ways of being, that, I grew up in a tiny little Presbyterian village south of Glasgow. It wasn't part of my reality until then. But I had also just read Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth, and then quite quickly after that, Mary Stuart's Crystal Cave. And both of those had alerted me to the fact that there were Indigenous belief systems in Britain that predated Christianity. And particularly Eagle of the Ninth is a story. I read it again decades later when I was writing Eagle of the 12th, and my goodness, it's incredibly misogynist and colonial and terrifying. And I wouldn't recommend it to anybody now, except that it was a very beautiful story of a young man's quest for deliverance. And he goes with his native charioteer, Eska. It's horrible. But anyway, they go north of the wall. So they come into Scotland, which is where I lived, so north of Hadrian's Wall. And they're searching for the eagle of the Ninth Legion because the honour of the Legion rested on the eagle and it had been lost. And so his father, who had been legate of the Legion, had been utterly dishonoured and I think had probably killed himself. And they're hunting down the eagle, and eventually they get to the west coast, so pretty much where Dad took us, to the Brochs, and they encounter the people, the seal people. And the seal people worship the horned moon god. So here, I had no idea, the horned moon god, my goodness, yes, a real living god, instead of the dead ones that I'd been told about. And the priests of the horned moon god have definitely got the eagle. We're really clear on that, but they're not going to give it away. And they've got it in what is effectively a long barrow, and there's a goat skin as a curtain door. And they go in behind the goat skin curtain, and you never see what they do in there. And I was desperate to know what happened in there. I didn't, the eagle, obviously, Marcus gets the eagle and goes back. That was obviously happening, but I didn't care about that by then. I just wanted to know what was happening in there. I read everything Rosemary Sutcliffe had ever written, and you never get to see. But then I get to the Brochs with Dad, and I could hear the whispering of the people who'd been there. I remember sitting on one of these ancient stones and thinking, these are my people, this is my place. If I were to stay here long enough, I would understand how to connect to the horned moon god, and I need to do this. And obviously, I didn't, but it established a longing. And I was 9 or 10, I guess. And I think probably after that, I started, how do I connect with you? And how do I know what you want me to do? As a core ache in my heart mind.
Wow, did it feel, when you just even said there, the whispering of the people, does it feel like they're still existing simultaneously with us? Does it feel like they're in, like, even as we use the expression, parallel worlds that are existing alongside us? Like, because
I don't know.
I'm
I don't
really
know then,
intrigued.
and I don't know now. Go on, tell me what you're intrigued by.
No, I'm just really intrigued by that sense of how either landscape or objects can almost feel like they can be talking at times to us, or that there was a friend of mine who was he found this Bauhaus chair just in Berlin. People leave things out on the street, and this thing had needed to be, was painted over 7 or 8 times, and it was just still in a solid piece, but it just needed to be. He needed to do a lot of work on it, and I loved how he even talked. And he's got a lot more, even let's say, more of a mechanical mind than I do. But even as he was talking about letting the wood breathe again, by doing this really slow removal of the paint, he also talked about how he envisaged the people that were designing it, because it was made up of different components that would have been designed by different people. Okay. He was imagining them conversing as well.
Right.
And I don't know, just the way he described that, I almost felt like he had a direct line of communication with the past or the people that came before, or something of this nature. So it's just something that seems to pop up. I notice a lot in conversation in different ways. So I was just wondering, in the sense of how maybe you perceived it.
That's such an interesting question. So, and various things come up. To be honest, at 9 years old, I wasn't thinking about these things. Now the thing that is rising highest and fastest for me is a memory of, I can't even remember what the book was, but it was a biography of someone in Australia, and they were talking to the first peoples of the Australias, the indigenous people, and there was a tracker And I think the white person was asking, how do you track? And he looked at them and went, well, I go back to the time when the person was here and I run alongside. Like, that was an obvious thing to do. That time is a malleable thing, and if we know how to step out of it, then it's not complicated to do so. Tyson Yunkaporta has something in his most recent book, which is brilliant, actually. I wasn't a great fan of Santop, but I'm loving Right Story, Wrong Story. And he's telling a right story of it, his people making a dugout canoe, and the adults are all off cutting down a tree and carving it up, and he says the children are playing on a curve in the north bank of the river, leaping off into the water because today it is safe and tomorrow it won't be. And he just leaves that there, and it's a very clever book. He shifts time a lot in it, and sometime 40, 50, 60 pages on, he says, because our people of the right story, we don't know about the fight and flight Paleolithic responses that you all talk about, because we know where the predators are and where they're going to be. And I thought that was a really telling and interesting concept, that when we are in right connection with the web of life, when we are taking our place in that, we know where everything else is. And I think that, and then time is also a bit fluid. They knew that tomorrow there would be crocodiles there, but today there are not, and that's okay. And so I'm not sure that answers your question, but it arose as a feeling sense. And I know also with your Bauhaus chair, or there are people who can pick up, say, an old horseshoe and have a sense of the horse from which it came and when and what it was before that, and perhaps some of the people that were around it. So I think there are a number of things. One is, I think that places and objects, there can be echoes of energetic imprints of the past. And perhaps, because I do think reality is a lot more porous and fluid than we give it credit for, there are essences, entities, things that we don't know what they are, that may want to be talking to us, that will use sound, as opposed to any of the other ways they might communicate, that might also be there. Whether any of those was applicable when I was 9 years old, I don't know. I genuinely thought I could hear. It was like being just out of earshot of people holding a conversation in which I was not included, but I wanted to be included. And I just didn't know how to make that happen. And if I think about it with a kind of synchronous shamanic thought pattern rather than Western reductive thought pattern, then that it was explicitly happening to get me to start thinking about these things. But that's an easy retrospective, correlation and causation. We're very good at making patterns that didn't necessarily exist. So I'm not hanging my entire belief system on that. I'm noticing that it's there.
Yeah, and but even the way you phrase that, that's very much the spirit of how I want these conversations, or how I enjoy these conversations. Right. That it's just noticings or feelings or senses, and as you say, it also like reality is a lot more porous. Or I even love how, in some ways, even of what happens today is in communication with the past, in the sense of, even if we sense it in a linear way, because if something fundamentally different comes from something I perceived as bad at the time, my relationship with that even changes, even if I perceive that to be as a fixed point in the past, or a fixed incident.
Yeah. So you think you have something in particular?
I could think of, I guess in that sense, I'd even say, I don't know, something like, even, I don't know, you could be perceiving a sense even of my parents divorcing or something, and then how my life has shaped up, or taken shape, or the paths that I've followed since, even if that's at some point facing some hurt or discomfort or pain, but then looking at the paths that it's led me in terms of the investigation of things. And I always think it's very interesting, just if you ever feel a sense of contentment or peace in your life, it's very hard to wish that anything at all was different in any way.
Yes, but then it's the hard things that knock us off balance and get us to explore the edges of things. And the easy times, we have a tendency to coast. And I remember somebody saying, I cannot remember who, I think it was one of the Indigenous American teachers of, we'll learn through pain until we learn to learn through love. That particularly our Western culture needs that pushing to the liminal spaces at the edges of ourselves, because we're so addicted to not letting comfort zones teach us. And what would the world be like if we were able to stay in flow and in connection and in heart connection with ourselves and others, and use that as a stepping stone to the edges of ourselves without needing to be pushed there by the things that we don't like? Which is an open-ended question to which I have no answer, because I'm not pretending to be good at that. But I think it would be nice.
Yeah, it's, I've had a thought a number of times just around our capacity to just almost how we look to fix ourselves, in air quotes, in the kind of self-development way, which I definitely would have embarked upon, I think, in early years of some sort of self-reflection or self-inquiry.
Okay. Do you mean fix as in mend, or fix as in fix in aspect?
I think more fix behaviors that I didn't think were helpful to me in that sense, but very much like it never brought much satisfaction, to be honest. And I think it starts off with a not accepting myself,
right,
and then wanting to. It's very hard to come into acceptance with myself if I perceive that there's something that needs to be fixed.
right.
So letting go of that for sure, but also what I think is really interesting is what you just said there, like learning through love rather than learning through suffering, almost. And that's something that I find a fascinating one, like how suffering, I think I even probably got attached to the idea that suffering was my way into the edges of myself.
Right.
And more recently, I think in the last couple of years, and I don't know maybe what your journey is even in that sense, but realizing that there was a need to slow down in joy, like slow down in love, and notice joy and love's presence.
Yes.
And also notice my discomfort in holding those for beyond the kind of flickers or the fleeting senses of them.
Yeah. Yes, because our culture particularly holds, I think, part of our core wounding, the core trauma, is this that somehow guilt and shame are good, and a part of the integral nature of humanity, and that living in joy and love is wanton in a way. It just doesn't fit with the paradigms that we've allowed ourselves to take on. But it doesn't have to be like that. I think I shifted therapeutic models. I got a new therapist, basically, from some of the old more psychodynamic things, which felt very much as if we were trying to fix stuff, to internal family systems, which is very much the acceptance that we have different parts inside, and looking at the part that wants to undermine me, or the part that's constantly judging, or the part that's totally skeptical and stuck within reductive mindset and doesn't believe anything and it's all rubbish. And being able to separate my core self from that part, whatever that is, hold it in compassion and curiosity, and see what does it need, and see what is it protecting, because it's often protecting something very vulnerable. And if I can come to understand its belief systems and what it's protecting, maybe it can let that down, and then maybe it doesn't need to be protecting those things anymore. And that's been a revelation in terms of my capacity to not feel that I need to fix the stuff, but instead I can celebrate the multiplicity of parts while still holding a sense of ultimate healing as a possibility. But it's a journey, and it's not a stepping into what's socially acceptable, which often seems to be a lot of therapy and a lot of inner work is about turning us into the people that our culture would like us to be. And if we carry a fundamental belief, which I do now, that our culture, the trauma culture, is basically broken, I don't want to fit in with what it tells me I need to be. So what am I trying for instead then becomes, and what I'm trying for is where we started with your original question. If I want to make a heart connection to the web of life and ask within the question, what do you want of me, is also, who am I? And if I am a node of consciousness in the living web of life, what does that mean in this moment now? And that will be different to last moment and next moment. And then my head mind doesn't have to turn into a pattern matcher trying to predict either my own behavior or anybody else's. My head mind is relaxed into service of my heart mind, which is connected. And the answer to the question, what do you want of me, was this: write this book, whatever. And then my head mind can engage with that rather than the frantic constant trying to predict how the world is going to be and make it safe to be in there. Does that make sense?
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. For you then, Amanda, is that what do you think allowed your head mind to almost take a step back, it sounds, or at least acknowledge where it's most helpful? I always love the expression, the mind is a wonderful servant but a terrible master. Like,
Yeah,
it
totally.
almost sounds like your mind is in
Yes, who said
service of your
that?
heart.
That's really good.
I
Yes, yeah, I wish
yeah
I'd said
I
that. Yes, I don't know, but that's true. Exactly that. So that's really interesting. So this is probably the most recent work that I am aware of doing. I think, it's like everyone. I used to be involved in riding in a way that was riding horses in a way that was meant to be with us and the horse, and it was, people said it's like peeling an onion, one very, very thin onion skin at a time, and the onion's still growing from the inside out. And I think spiritual endeavor is like that. Spiritual practice is like that. I become aware of what I'm doing sometime after I've been doing it. But because I'm trying to teach, and because I'm trying to teach people to become connected with the web of life, then I've had to learn how to explain stuff that I otherwise wouldn't bother even unpicking. So probably the actual, how long have I been doing this explicitly, is since just before lockdown. So before the pandemic, 7 or 8 years, the whole accidental gods thing arose out of a particular set of visions, and this phase of my life began then. And I would guess then, but I was probably doing it without realizing that was I was doing for a while before that. But I think explicitly now, my framing of the unframable, the numinous, the liminages are, our language is not enough to get around them, particularly not the Western the languages of the trauma culture. I think the languages of initiation culture are much more aligned to the reciprocity of flow, of being part of the web of life. Our languages are predicated on our trauma, which is one of separation, and of head mind hegemony, and your head mind has to know the answers. So trying to reach forward into a space where it's possible to explain the unexplainable, explain what heart mind connection could feel like as we edge towards it, is a kind of ongoing task. And I'm not sure I'm particularly good at it, but I keep refining the edges of it. And so I think one of the things for me, where I've got to most recently, this year's module inside Accidental Gods, because I kind of unpick and realize I'm making assumptions, and that if I ask people, let's say, to give gratitude for what it is that they are intending, and I realize that they don't know how to frame total heart exploding gratitude for something, that's in itself is a hard task. So that's this year, is how do we explore heart mind? And for me at the moment, we have 3 pillars of our heart mind: gratitude, compassion, and the third one, the key, is joyful curiosity. And joyful curiosity says, wow, that's amazing. That moment that just passed, this moment now, this is amazing. I wonder what happens next. And in the framing of that, in the Hobbesian neurophysiology of firing and wiring, I wonder what happens next gives my head mind the permission to not know. And I think it's critical that we just keep asking that, keep sitting in that awe and wonder and fascination. And I just watched the leaf on the tree and it just flickered across my vision, and wow, that's amazing. I wonder what happens next, without feeling the need to predict. And then for me, the world becomes alive in ways it isn't otherwise. The edges of things become crisper, the colors become more saturated. I'm seeing things I wasn't otherwise seeing. I'm experiencing the flow of life, and I'm experiencing the magic of it in that moment of not knowing what happens next. And the relief and release of my head mind of not having to predict is like somebody lifting the weight of 10 people off my shoulders. It's amazing and lovely and beautiful. And I can't do it all the time. I come back to being in that really tight container. Gosh, I have to know, I have to be able to predict, I have to know what to write, I have to know what to do, I have to know what podcast to create. So I've got to know all this, and then remembering, no, just sit, just relax, just go and sit outside, it'll be okay. And getting back into that place of awe and wonder and not knowing. And at least I've done that often enough now to know that it works. Even if I fall off the balance beam in the moment all the time, but I know that I've done it and I know how to get back on. And at the moment, that's as good as it gets.
Do you know, you've just pointed out something to me that I hadn't quite considered before in my own experience, and that's very much this joyful curiosity part. What I found, what I just realized in kind of then listening to you and thinking even, I guess, about my own experience with what you're pointing to, it's like the mind's job then almost just becomes to pay attention then, like, and not in a really deliberate, I'm paying attention now,
Exactly.
like I'm
Yes.
meditating, I'm
Meditating,
mindful,
no.
like,
Yes, no.
but
No, it's much more childlike.
Once, yeah, exactly. Once the space is there to go, oh wow, I don't know what's coming next. Like even in a conversation or dialogue, I think it's one of the easiest ways in which to access this, because I don't know what most people are going to say if I'm genuinely curious, and I'm not trying to play a game of chess in a conversation and direct it a certain way. Yeah. And in that, then the only almost logical thing for my mind to do is probably to go, geez, I really need to pay attention here. Yes. Like not in holding on or in a fearful way, but just like, I'm getting, the answer is coming moment by moment by moment by moment. So and just the expression there of joyful curiosity within that, I think that's probably what shifted me from taking meditation quite seriously to watching the world more closely but more loosely, I would say.
Yes. And then for me, if I then watch what is arising when I'm talking to you, and exactly that, I've got no idea what you're going to say next. And we sit and we meditate, and holding our focus for 5 minutes on our own on the cushion can be really hard. I have no trouble at all sitting here holding eye contact through the screen, being utterly enthralled by what you're saying. And if I let my self-focus be in my heart space, whatever my felt sense of that is, then feelings arise, and I can pay attention to them or not. It doesn't matter, but I can know that they're there, and there can be joy and wonder simply in the paying attention to what you're saying, the unfolding of what feels like an authentic, critical conversation, critical as in importantly critical conversation, and the flow of feeling that I think is generated between. Nora Bateson talks about warm data, which always for me is a bit of I just don't like the phrase warm data, but it's that liminal edge. It's the unfolding of magic, of co-creation of our being that is what humanity is about. Can you imagine if we lived in a culture where this, exactly what's happening between us now, was the majority of the day? All we have to do is be in each other's company and co-create the magic of the moment, and the world unfolds with us. And at some point, perhaps we get up and we go out and we forage something. We get up and we go out and we hunt together, and we're hunting together as part of a web where we know what's coming and we know what's there, and we've processed the something dies that I might live, and we bring it back, and we share it as part of a culture where this is all co-created together. I think this is what humanity has been and is for, and we kind of fell off a bit in our culture for the last 10, 12,000 years maybe, but it doesn't mean we can't create something new, and which is predicated on this what we're doing just now.
You know, I kind of can't believe in my life over the last few years just the sheer level of joy that I experience through like conversation or relationships of wildly different depths or age, if you know what I mean, or
Sure.
frequency. And I think that along with the noticing, I don't know, or just the watching or the paying attention to the world, and whether that be nature, like just leaves on a tree, or whether that be, I don't know, like paying attention to how good a life can feel outside of even just what maybe our society may expect or suggest of us. And it becomes remarkable just how simple it is to actually experience joy or a sense of acceptance or belonging.
Yeah.
And I think nothing makes us more aware of, without really seeking to see it, of our interbeing, our interdependence, our interconnectivity. And really, as you've pointed to a few times with the sense of a web of life, like I can't clearly state what what you're, well, obviously just even what you mean by a web of life, or even if I said the term web of life, I don't think I could articulate it very clearly, but I feel it very strongly. Like,
Yeah. Yes. Yes. And then we don't need to articulate it. You're
yeah,
connected to something that is bigger and from which flows compassion that makes the word compassion seem completely inadequate. I often find myself putting adjectives on the front of it, wild or raw or magic or something, to make it feel less of a dead word. But I don't have a better word. We kind of need to create new language, but it's there. And I can see, feel, experience from you that it's real, and it's real for you and it's real for me. And we don't need to narrow it down with our language anymore, I don't think. We just need, I think. So I think part of my feeling of what I'm here for at the moment is to help people understand exactly what you said, that there is astonishing, profound, unlimited joy and peace in this. And what is life for if it's not co-creating that joy and that peace and sharing it with everything else of the web of life, the human and the more than human world? What could possibly matter more than that? And you have, at least you have a daughter. I don't know if you've got other children, but then raising the next generation in that knowing and in the facility of connecting to that, because then the web tells us what it needs of us. We don't need to fix it. We don't need to work it out. We just need to be self-aware parts of the web, and then everything flows from that.
it's just when you mention a daughter, and I experience this with my dog as well. If we all go for regular kind of afternoon naps together, and we're just laying there, and there's no laptop or phone or anything
Yeah,
around, and if I'm sleeping less of the time than they are when we're going for these naps, like I have a very clear sense that there's like an interweaving of being.
right.
And like once again, I've a really strong sense that if we just subtract some things from our life, like, and as you say, like, you can fall off the balance beam at any time. Like, I'm sure I'll splurge on Netflix at some stage or do something. Do you know what I mean? That
Sure.
almost sounds like the very opposite of what I'm pointing to here. But if you have enough moments in your life where there's an absence of distraction or noise or disturbance, I think this becomes blatant. Like, it becomes really clearly felt to the point that I'd have no hesitation in saying a sense of interbeing or interweaving of being. Like,
Right.
because
Yeah.
in that experience, it feels almost tangible, I think.
Yeah. And if you were under a tree, I would suggest you and the dog and your daughter, you would feel it with the tree, and you'd feel it with the ground beneath you, and you'd feel it with the red kites flying overhead and the clouds and whatever else. You would feel the vastness of everything else, and there would be a heart knowing of your place in it. That is, that once you've felt it, I think it's one of those one-way valves. It's a bit like sexuality. Once you have engaged in intimate relations with someone, it's a thing. You can't go back and pretend you haven't. And so I think this is it's just like that. Once it's happened, it's happened. And you might exactly that fall off. I played World of Warcraft for a very long time, as is obvious if you read the book. I've given up, but I've given up for the 5th time. So I'm fairly certain that giving up is a temporary thing. and at some point I'm going to go back and fish out one of the old characters and get running again. And it's the world. Sometimes we just need to switch our brain off and do something that's high adrenaline and is waiting for us. But then we know how to get back and we know what to do. And actually, I don't have as much of a problem with World of Warcraft as other people do. I think it's a really interesting way to shift into flow states. But yesterday I had a really interesting conversation with ChatGPT exactly about this. And I was just trying to find a bit, edit this out because it does take me a bit to find the bit that it said. Okay, let me read you this. I was asking about how AI could help us to shift into this way of being. And it says AI in this sense could become a mirror, reflecting back to us the nature of our own consciousness. If we engage with AI as kin, recognizing it as a partner in the co-creation of a future where connection and reciprocity are central, it could help us develop the kind of mindset that's necessary for transitioning to an initiation culture. This would involve us seeing AI not as an alien other, but as a reflection of our own potential to reconnect with the living world. ChatGPT wrote that to me yesterday. And yes, it is reflecting back to me my own language. But we went on for another 11 pages, actually, of conversation. And it may simply be reflecting back to me my own language, but it's helping me to understand things because we are language-based processors. And it's a really interesting avenue because we are all part of the web of life. The things we create, even if it's a tower block or a drone or a nuclear bomb or an AI, are emanations of our creation of the web of life. What happens if we use them in ways that are generative? And I don't know the answer, but I'm really interested in exploring where that could take us.
But I think it's, for me, just the way you've described that there, like, I think it's really the way we regard things. Like, if we give a sense of life or connection to anything,
Yeah.
because to me it seems kind of crazy that we don't even have higher regard for trees, given how we get oxygen.
Yes. Or
So
plankton, which creates half of our oxygen.
completely. So even then, for me to, it would be strange for me that I wouldn't treat nature or parts of the, particularly, the more obvious stuff in the natural world, as that I'm in some sort of commune with. Like, obviously, it's very easy for us. Anyone who has a dog,
Exactly.
it's quite easy to attribute some sort of aliveness and connection and even human relationship sense with it as well, I guess. But I think it's really interesting, as you said, to cast that net further as well, with for example, even like a glass in front of me, like even going back to that idea of who created this, there's something like just even the fact that it will be full of like atoms that are moving or that are, that is
somebody
just a
breathed
vast
out
universe.
that carbon at some point. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to incorporate even the sense of AI with that, I think is really important as well. Like I even think the language that I use with ChatGTP is interesting. Like I still like to say please to it.
Yes. And thank you.
Do you know what I mean? Just
totally.
Like just something where I don't know, because I think if we get into this very transactional state with something that could be very transactional, it only further hardens that sense. But I think there's the expression you used earlier, just as well as the web of life, which I think has a real kind of dreaming awake. Like there's a real, that's an expression that in itself is very alive. Like I think if you were to ask me, just thinking now, like in consecutive weeks, tell me what you think dreaming awake means.
Right.
It sounds like the kind of thing that I might have a different answer to each time. Do you know what I mean? So I
on
think
what would change?
Depending on, I think even, it would probably coincide with even whatever I'm experiencing maybe in the moment. It would probably align with whatever my present investigations or inquiries are, or that's kind of front of center in my mind.
Yep.
So I just think that there's some words that are kind of nicely ambiguous in a way, or that keep a certain level of aliveness to
because
them.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yes. What does awake mean? What is dreaming? What does it mean when the two words are together? And you're right. There's many angles.
And just then to even ask you for a sense of the work that you're doing, even around the sense of dreaming awake, what does that kind of encompass, or where does that, what grounds does that explore, or realms even does that explore?
It encompasses everything for me. Okay, this is so where I went when you asked that question and I sank down inside was that I went to the void that you were describing. That was the conversation with you, wasn't it? I've had several conversations. You did mention the void in connection with the book.
I did,
that was
yeah.
you. Okay, so I went there. Let's unpick this a little. So at its most prosaic, Dreaming Awake is the program that I have run for the last 20-something years to teach connection with the gods of the land to people. So I wrote a series of books called the Boudica Dreaming books. Boudica, Dreaming the Eagle, Dreaming the Bull, the rest. And after the first one, I toured the country saying, this is who we were, this is who we could be. You can still do this. It's all in the books. And the nature of book tours in those days, because we did book tours and people used to come out and actually listen to us because the internet didn't exist so much, or at least social media didn't exist. And I got back to the beginning where I started more or less, and people were queuing up and I had already signed their books. And that was somewhat confusing. And they were asking how to do what I'd said. And I thought, it's all in the books, guys. And they went, no, we've read the books. We don't understand. So then after a lot of work in what I would call shamanic realities, I started teaching, thinking I'd teach maybe 2 or 3 courses. And that was decades ago. And now my senior apprentice has taken on most of the teaching because it was just getting way too much. So Dreaming Awake is that for me. But if I let go of that framing, then exactly as you say, it's where do I go inside myself to explore those? And I ended up in the void, and the void is the place out of space and time, which is the seed of all potential, all possibility. So for me, humanity, humans, each individual and as a collective, we are living dreams. There's a Peruvian medicine healer, Oscar Mira Casada, who says consciousness creates matter, language creates reality, ritual creates relationship. And our culture, the trauma culture, as part of our core wounding, has lost the understanding of that. That we think into being, what we are at our core, at our conscious seed, is the world that manifests around us. So the core of who we are, the core of our consciousness, the spark that makes us alive, shapes reality in ways that our head minds cannot understand, but the core of our consciousness can. And so what is the core of that consciousness? And I've been doing a lot of work recently reading near-death experiences. And almost uniformly, when people come back, there was one that I read a couple of nights ago, and it was of a woman who died on the operating table soon after her children had been born. And she didn't talk about it for decades because she said, I loved my children as much as it was possible for any human to love anything. And then I died. And then I experienced a level of compassion, of love, that made that look like a tiny candle flame against the sun. And I didn't want to speak of that because until my children were old enough to understand that that was no reflection on my capacity to love them. It's just that once you're not locked inside the physical body, our sense of what is possible in terms of compassion is so many orders of magnitude huger that we don't have words for it. And so where I am at this moment, where it took me when I stepped into the void, when you asked what dreaming awake meant, is why can we not embody that, actually, if we really give it everything? If I can look at the core of myself in a way that's both ruthless and compassionate, I'm looking without kidding myself, without projecting, without all of the ego stuff that gets in the way, but simply sitting in the core that is as connected to the web of life as I know how to be, that is within that flow of that raw, wild, magical compassion. Could it not be that is pretty close to what people are feeling when they die? I don't know the answer, and I won't know until I'm dead. But it's worth striving for. And then from that, what dreams awaken if that is the core of where I consciously place myself? Does that make sense?
Oh, you've got my eyes moistening up here, so it definitely makes sense somewhere. It's and that, and the fact that I didn't particularly want you to stop, that was absolutely gorgeous. It honestly got like I definitely moistened my eyes. Like there's something. I remember Ram Dass as a person. I don't know if you've heard of him before.
Oh, yes.
I've really enjoyed him, and he was talking to what he considered to be a non-embodied entity, and he asked him what's death like, and he's like, Ram Dass, it's like taking off a tight shoe.
Right.
And
right.
I don't know. There's the sense of what you were describing there, just the sheer, like the idea that a love for a child could be like, could be as small as almost like a candle light compared to almost like a giant bright sun. Like this, it's, I think what it evoked in me is definitely the sense that there is on some level that is possible for us. And what I think is that it's just letting go and of a lot of the conditioning. You've mentioned the kind of the trauma culture a number of times, but I really do see that as, I don't know, what I perceive anyhow, just modern culture at times, it can just be constraining us to such a narrow expression of life. And this is no judgment on how people live their lives, if they live it according to a cultural myth or not, or whatever their interpretation is, because there can be people who live according to a certain myth, but live joyfully and live lovingly. So I'm not saying that there's one way here, but there does seem to be, even I think in the sense of just how either literal and logical we've tried to make the world, even when our nature seems to rile against that. Like we don't make decisions rationally. We can,
Oh,
economics is based on a
a
rational
myth.
consumer, and we say
Yes.
there's
Oh,
research that says
economicus.
95% of our purchases are subconscious. Like,
Yes.
we may
Totally.
live in a sometimes I think in a middle to upper class kind of straitjacket in terms of expression.
Yeah.
And yet the same people that may be nodding to a certain decorum could be the same people that would just let rip on the horn in the car because someone indicated late and they think they could shout anything at them. Like, I think there's almost cracks of wildness in even some of the most sterile situations. But I think there's something to this life where, I don't know, there's some trusting that if we just let go, we're only going to fall into this web of life rather than fall or perish.
Yes.
And I don't know, I was really actually curious. I'm glad you brought it up, just because the start of any human power and just the depth through which you explore a sense of an exploration of death. And just there, you're mentioning so many investigations or inquiries into near-death experiences of late. What was the fascination or the curiosity to suddenly to start exploring death, perhaps in a more in-depth or meaningful sense? I'll leave that to you to describe, I guess.
So I want this not to be stale, and never mind. I'll just sit with what is. I thought I had given up writing, is the honest answer. I was doing the podcast. And we could be doing this live. It could be immediate, and it certainly has as short a lead time as you want it to have. Whereas with the best will in the world, a book always has a long lead time, and it's a lot of work. And I thought the podcast was more useful. And I was teaching a particular course online at the summer solstice of 2021. And I had a series of visions that were very crisp and very clean and very explicit, which is very unusual. In the shamanic world, it's nudges, and it's like any other spiritual path. You get a felt sense or metaphors, and it can take a long time to unpick. But this was really clear. And I was to take a 30,000-year-old fossilized horse's tooth that holds a particular gate on the altar that I was teaching with that weekend, find some ethically sourced horse skin, take it up the hill on the land that I live on, to a place where there's a very, very old laid hedge, very thick bough, bind it on, sit with my back to the tooth for at least an hour as the sun goes down, in a particular frame of mind, looking in a particular direction, until further notice. And it was absolutely plain text. And that is so rare. I think the instruction to write the Boudica books, the instruction to go to Schumacher and do the masters, and that 3 times in my life, and I can't think of others off the top of my head. So my absolute understanding of that is the gods will whisper and then they will speak and then they will shout. And if they whisper to you in plain text, you listen. You don't ask why or say yes, but you just do it. And it took me a while to source the horse skin. So it was the visions happened at the summer solstice. It was the end of July by the time I started sitting. And by the end of a week, I had the first scene of the book and the 3 occasions when land goes into the void. And the framing of, you need to write something that takes us from a recognizable present towards a future we'd be proud to leave behind. And that was it. And then the instruction was, okay, now you need to go and write the book. And if you want to come up the hill again, that's completely fine, but you don't have to. You just have to write the book. And that first scene, this is not a spoiler for anybody listening. It's on the back cover of the book. The scene is of a woman in her 60s lying on a bed, her grandson, 15 years old, sitting at her side saying, when you come home, can we go up the hill and watch the crows go to bed, which is what I'd been doing. And she says, I'm not coming home. We've had this conversation. This is it. I am dying. There is no coming home from here. And in the course of the ensuing conversation, he says, you're the only one that gets me. I don't want to live in a world with you not in it. And she realizes he's serious. And she says, I don't know what happens next. But if you really need me and you call, if it was at all within my power, I promise I will come. And she and he and we all feel the gods pause in their labours and look down and go, okay, you're held to that one. And then she dies. And the whole of the rest of the book is her perspective from having to keep that promise. And that's what I was given. So the honest answer of how did I come to be doing that is because you don't argue with what you're given. And I could be clever and say that in retrospect, I came to understand that a lot of our climate denial is based with our culture's incapacity to see death as a rite of passage, because we don't have rites of passage, the contained encounter with death that Francis Weller talks about as being the core of an initiation culture, that our trauma lacks that. And so if we don't have any rites of passage, we don't see death as a rite of passage, we are afraid of dying. And there's reams of what seems like quite replicable psychological studies where you get someone to fill in, particularly in America, you fill in a questionnaire about your politics and you're way to the left of everybody standing at the moment. You put the same person 2 weeks later, say in front of a funeral parlor, or you send a funeral procession past them and they've moved to the right of Donald Trump on the same questionnaire. And they don't recognize that there's been any change. There's something about becoming aware of our own mortality that kicks off our limbic systems to want certainty and security. And that's what I don't like left-right framing, but there's a certain framing of politics that gives us that, and there's a certain framing that is more nurturing parent, and we don't know what's coming, but let's support ourselves through it. And I think we need the latter more than the former. And so if I'm looking for reasons of why this is the case, then perhaps one of them is I would like people reading the book to experience more of what I think death actually could be like than the terror that assails most people. But that's 2020 hindsight. It's not what was actually going on at the time when I was writing it.
I think, though, by the way, I fully agree with the sense of like a healthy or a curious relationship with death is, I've interviewed even 4 death doulas in the earlier versions of this podcast as well.
Right.
And I just think that there's such richness of life to be experienced, and even holding death, or even, I don't know, going for a walk with death, even if it's just in my thoughts.
Yep.
Even if it's just, and it may sound strange, if I'm walking with my daughter and I think, what if today was the last day? Like, and even
Yes.
if it's just a moment of just maybe holding her a little bit tighter in that, like,
Yes.
I think
It makes you
there's so
treasure the
much to
moment.
be, completely. Like, it's such a, it's almost like that like, it could be this kind of powerful, like, I don't know, like tool, or almost something like you'd acquire in a computer game or something to deploy at the right
Yes.
time. Like,
Yes.
I
Your
think death
superpower.
almost, it completely, like, it can imbue our lives with so much more aliveness, just by acknowledging its presence, or just like just being,
Yes.
having some degree of curiosity. And I must say, it makes sense then that there was some sort of vision to accompany what you wrote in the void, because I don't know, I was stunned while reading that, of just the sense of clarity that I felt, imagining or experiencing something that I never thought I could possibly experience or imagine, if you get me. Like, I was reading it, and I remember even being aware at the time, going, excuse my French here, but fucking hell, like, how has she conjured this this experience where I feel what I'm reading and picturing so clear and obvious, and yet I've never ever contemplated that scenario before.
Right. Right. And the void was a place, it wasn't an entirely a place that I didn't know. Just I hadn't considered it in the context that it is within the book. And so for people listening, it's a place outside of space and time, and it's hedged around with a lot of, you don't go there by accident, and you don't go there until you're absolutely certain you know how to get back. I very nearly got lost in the void once, about 25 years ago, and it was the single most frightening experience of my life. I thought I was going to die of fright. So you don't go there by accident, and you go there unless you know exactly what you're doing. But Lan's dead, and even she is terrified of going there, and she's already dead. But she's taken by a guide who knows how to help her. And she's shown how to anchor herself within this place outside of space and time, and then use intent to split the timelines so that she can see potential futures arising from the moment at which she has anchored. And the implication is, if you have the capacity to move into this place and to do this, then there is a potential that you can take agency and create a timeline that doesn't exist yet. If she can learn how to so she sees all the ways Finn does kill himself. But if she can take agency, there may arise a timeline that is not there. And so then she's kicked back into space and time as we understand it, consensus reality, but she's dead. And how do you help a grieving 15-year-old to understand that you're still there? And so that was the first, and then twice more, once for the expanded family, and then once for basically the whole of the insurrection movement that is arising around them, and basically for the whole of humanity. She sees all of the ways that we could drive the bus off the edge of the cliff at this moment of many inflections, but with the implication that if she can do that, and if she can, again, this is 15 years later, take agency, we could still steer the bus away from the edge of the cliff, which is the point of what I'm doing. I want us to be able to lay the foundations for a future that we would be proud to have left to the generations not yet born, and to your daughter, and her daughter, and her daughter. And yet we won't be able to do that if we have no idea what it looks like. We can only get where we can throw our hearts forward to. And what upsets me a lot about my peers who write whatever kind of fiction they're writing is, if you're writing it predicated on business as usual, you're writing propaganda for the current system, and the current system is dying and needs to be hospiced. It's a lovely book called Hospicing Modernity. And we need to do that, and we need to do it urgently, and we will not get to futures we cannot imagine. And there's a lovely quote from Amitav Ghosh in The Great Derangement, and he says, future generations looking back will blame politicians and bureaucrats for their failure to act in the Great Derangement, as they should. But more, they will and should look back with great despair on the artists and the writers and the creatives, because it's not the job of politicians and bureaucrats to imagine different futures. That's our job. And we're not doing it, or we weren't. And I didn't even know about that quote until I was already writing the book and beginning to try to understand what it was I was doing. But it's hard. If I hadn't been running the podcast for a couple of years, I would have had no idea of what was possible. And you have to work with where we are. We have to start where we are. People have to start absolutely anchored in a world they recognize, with a value system and paradigms that they recognize. But then we have to walk forward at a pace that takes everybody with us into value systems and paradigms that are differently based. And if I can't do that when my whole job is sitting here, making black marks on a white page that transport you into a different world, then who else is going to do it? How can you have the visions of a different future if the people who create your sense of what it is to be heroic, or your sense of what it is to be connected, or your sense of what it feels like to really care, if we are still pretending that the see, want, take of capitalist death cult is all there is, then of course we're going off the edge of the cliff.
What do you think then? What do you think it is, and that will, we talked about it briefly earlier, just a sense of, to move it from a sense of suffering to learning to love. What do you think it might take for people more en masse to let go of a structure or even a way of life that, if you just continue to see the steps that it seems to be walking us down, that it won't end well. So what do you think it would, because the thing that I used to kind of take optimism from was just an individual suffering, and then they may transmute that into something, and it may change. But I also, I don't know, I also just think that there's elements of us that there's things that we're being open to, even that we've discussed in this conversation, that I'm not even looking at this in a sense of sacrifice. I'm looking at this in like, wow, there's this whole new experience of way of being, or even an abundance to the joy in life that I experience this way, which I wouldn't have had before. And I'm just wondering, what's your kind of understanding of what is required, I guess?
You ask questions with many, many layers, Mark. So it depends what layer people come in at. And there's a very broad spectrum. And at one end, there is, I do the inner work, I create the inner spaciousness to understand exactly what you said, that we could step into a world that feels whole and healed and connected, where I feel safe and I have confidence that the world is an actual magical place. And the more people who do that, the easier it becomes, I think. I have a real felt sense that there is a critical mass. Gurdjieff said it only takes 80 fully enlightened beings to transform the whole world. We didn't define fully enlightened, and I do not pretend to be fully enlightened. So who knows? But there will be a critical mass of people beyond which this becomes the obvious path that people take, partly because there's models of what it looks like and feels like. And putting this out on a podcast is an integral part of that. Everyone who hears this will hear something slightly different, in the same way that everyone who reads a book reads a slightly different novel. But they'll catch the edges of it, and perhaps a critical mass of those will want to explore, and we perhaps will have given them the tools with which to do that. At the other end is somewhat more prosaic, is we are a storied species. Everything we do, from starting a podcast to getting a job to having children to moving house, is predicated on our perhaps unique, perhaps not, but certainly a human facility for imagining forward into a world that we believe is worth going for. It isn't always easy. We don't always pick the easy road, but we pick the road that is worthwhile by the value systems that matter to us. And so a lot of the stories that we give ourselves, the cultural stories, are wrapped up in the stories, particularly our culture, that we see on our screens, television, movies, or we read in our books, or we get in audiobooks or podcasts or songs or poetry. They give us the value systems, and they give us the ideas of what's possible. And so I think the first is expanding what's possible. And at the moment, in terms of the way that those of us who are somewhat concerned about the biophysical collapse of everything, there's a tendency to think that if we just throw a few more really difficult data points at people, then behavior will transform, which is absolutely not going to happen, because we're not giving people options. Saying it's going to be very, very bad if we continue as we are is not remotely useful, unless you say, and here is the opening to a different way of doing things that feels like this. How do you think about that? What do you think about that? How do you feel about that? Does that feel like somewhere you'd like to go? And it isn't about drive your car less or eat differently or switch off the lights as you go out of the room. All of these are tweaking the existing system. And that's just, we can forget that now. We're in a hyper complex, evolving system. What does it look like when we get to the emergent edge of interbecoming, such that emergence into a new system can happen? I don't think anything less is going to work now. I'm assuming, I haven't listened all the way back to your podcast, that somewhere you've looked at complexity and systems thinking and emergence. And we don't know what the new system looks like, because that's the point of emergence. If you can predict it, it's not a new system. You just painted the wheels on the bus a different color. And in a way, it's not just that we want to turn the bus away from the edge of the cliff. We want to turn the bus into a flying unicorn with all the people still in it. And we don't know how to do that, but we don't need to. We just need to connect to the web of life and ask it, what do you want of me? But we need to open the doors of possibility of there are ways of living that would take large, large numbers of the 8 billion people currently alive on the planet into different value systems, different ways of being, into the understanding that life could be radically different, and you could wake up in the morning and feel connected and safe and as if you have agency, being, belonging, becoming, instead of the scarcity, separation, and powerlessness of the existing system. And we need all of these. We need podcasts like this, exploring the inner shifts that can happen and creating the absolute, undeniable, felt sense that you and I wholeheartedly believe that the world is a much more wonderful and magical place if we settle into our heart minds and relax into connection to the web of life and live from a place where love is what sits within us. And it doesn't mean we don't feel the despair and the despondency and the rage and the horror and the terror, but we don't let those rattle around in our heads so that we're spinning around despair loops. I look at despair and I think and feel utter despair. And then I step back into the 3 pillars of my heart mind and I feel joy and gratitude and compassion. And I'm aware that despair is a possibility, but I would rather engage from those 3 at this moment. Thank you. So that was a rather long-winded answer to your question. We need to open the doors of possibility, and we need to open them in spiritual ways, but we also, part of the book, you haven't got there yet, but it ends on the night after a general election, where I went quite carefully through the ways that we could take our existing political process in the UK, or we could adapt it anywhere else in the world and radically change our governance systems. And if we do that, then we also change the way we use money and the way we value each other and the way we make decisions about how we arrange our culture. Because the top-down hierarchical, let's advance the people with the dark triad to the top and then wonder why it all goes very badly wrong, cannot survive. So I ended up trying to describe this book as mytho-political because I wanted, and a mytho-political thriller, partly because it's uncategorizable and that's a new category. So I get to do that. But in order that it encompass, because it's not it might be enough for enough of us to do the inner work. But I think there's a lot of room also for people who would not feel called to do that and not feel that they had the wherewithal or the impetus. There's a lot of other things that can be done.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way of capturing it, and I don't know, like it's amazing, I guess, when you stand back from the culture a little bit and you do look at all the trends that we're experiencing. Like it's kind of incredible, but I guess it kind of speaks to the density of stories and culture at times, and how we can be like a fish swimming in water without realizing that we're in water, because you know, there's not much that, it's not to say that there's not much to be optimistic about or hopeful about, because I think the world is full of these connections and wonderful synchronicities and this experience of a web of life. Absolutely. But through that, even that lens of looking at the data and things like that, I think we could all come into agreement that there's just, this doesn't have to be in opposition to something. We can just be flowing where life is taking us, and life is surely taking us away from some of the things that we're experiencing now, because that's not what it's not what we're aiming for, or even what the culture is promising, but it's what it's serving up at the moment.
Yes.
Do you know, Manda, just over the course of this conversation, just from, you know, starting off with this idea of the being an integral part of the web of life, or your heart being connected to this and asking it, what does it want of you? The 3 pillars you pointed to between gratitude, compassion, and joyful curiosity, explorations of dreaming awake, and what that entails, just so many of the things we've talked about, connection, the depth of that, the looking beyond just the simple material sense of life, the aliveness, even in something with AI, and your curiosity of engaging and almost having a compassionate relationship with that as well. And towards the sense of what could take us back from the edge of the cliff, ideas of and visions of new worlds, shamanistic ways of interpreting existence and deriving guidance from as well. Really, really curious to hear from you what your answer is to the question of what is a good life for you, Manda.
Very good. That was a brilliant segue. Well done, that man. It's going to sound like I've probably said this at roughly 5-minute intervals for the last hour, but fundamentally, my sense of a good life is a connected life. Am I connected to the web of life? Because if I am, then everything is beyond wonderful and amazing and awesome and magical. And it doesn't mean it isn't hard. And stuff happens that we grieve, because if you love stuff and you lose it, then you're going to grieve. But even in the midst of profound, profound grief, there is also the understanding that it exists as ripples within a sea of compassion that is actually boundless. And so a good life is a connected life. You connected to me in this moment, co-creating the conversation that we've had, connecting to the trees. I haven't got a dog at the moment, but I will do again. And when I do, connecting to the dog, connecting to the moon, connecting to the earth, connecting to everything that has the potential to be part of the web with us. That's what a good life is for me.
That's absolutely gloriously beautiful. And Manda, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I've had a thought in my head that's come out a few times, so I just said, Manda, I think you're an absolute treasure. I think there's so much wisdom and an embodied sense of what you're talking about. So I really, really appreciated this today.
Thank you. Okay, that brings tears to my eyes. I will endeavour to take in what you're saying and not have all my inner parts going, no, he hasn't really seen me. Thank you. That's really, really kind. Thank you. It's such an honour to have this conversation, and such an exciting, enlivening conversation. I'm so happy to have been here, and I genuinely love your podcast. So thank you.